Hello and welcome to Backlisted. This episode is one of those where we go back into the past, in fact, quite a long way past. We're going all the way back to 2016. This is episode 20, which was recorded back when we were recording in real life in Wharf Road in Islington in London with our original producer, Matt Hall, Andy and I, and the guest, the great Slang lexicographer, man who's produced, I think, the greatest work of linguistic reference on his own over the last 30 years, Jonathon Green's Dictionary of Slang. It's an episode that we haven't listened to for a long time, but it comes out of the traps and feels, I think, incredibly relevant.
This is an episode about the novel Absolute Beginners by Colin MacInnes, and this is notable for several reasons. One is it's my favourite novel ever written by anyone, and it's one of John's favourites.
It is.
And it was a great pleasure to be able to rig things so that we were able to do a show about this novel. It changed my life. I say that very carefully because I'm not a great believer in that cliche, but this book did change my life when I read it when I was 15 in the early 1980s. And it was an absolute delight to talk about it with John and with Jonathon Green, who he won't mind me saying, I'm sure, is a generation ahead of me and had his life changed in turn when he first read it in the 1950s and 60s. For those of you who don't know the novel, it's set in the summer of 1958 in the Notting Hill area of London across 4 months, in the period of the race riots that took place there, where in August of that summer, gangs of Teds, as they were then, roamed West London looking to cause harm to immigrants. And we're recording this in summer 2024, where unfortunately, in the UK, similar scenes have been played out. And I tweeted during the recent disturbances, the recent racist riots, which took the pretext of anti-immigrant
protest
feeling as their basis. And I tweeted to say, you know what? Absolute Beginners by Colin MacInnes should have been on the UK schools curriculum years ago, because it is like no other British novel about this topic. And had it been on the curriculum, there might now be fewer racists roaming the streets looking to cause trouble. I loved this novel when I was 15, and I love it now I'm 56. And it'll be a sad day when I don't love it anymore. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I hope you not enjoy its relevance. We recorded this 8 years ago about a book that was written nearly 60 years ago, but it still feels topical in a way that we could all learn from. John?
Yeah, absolutely. It also, another kind of coincidence, when we recorded an episode with the great publisher Margaret Busby, she came on to talk about the British Caribbean writer Andrew Solkey with Roman Antrobus a couple of years ago. This book came up in conversation then because Alison and Busby reissued Absolute Beginners. That was in 1980, another period when there were riots on the streets of London. So this book is extraordinary in the way that it keeps coming back. Its relevance has never really ebbed, and it's certainly its literary quality, I think, sets it apart for cult novels enjoyed by teenagers. It's a genuine work of art.
And for those of you who remember the musical from the mid-80s, I advise you to try and forget it, please. Please. So join us now. Jump in our time machine back to 2016 for our discussion of Absolute Beginners by Colin MacInnes with our guest,
Jonathon Green.
How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Visit USAA.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
The new McCrispy Strip is here. Dip approved by ketchup, tangy barbecue, honey mustard, Sprite, McFlurry, Big Mac sauce, double dipped in buffalo and ranch, more ranch, and creamy chili McCrispy Strip Dip. Now at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. No,
I know, I'm with you on that. Why would you? You know,
I've got a 10. Did you hear that little higher pitch in my voice?
Oh, come on.
Come on, everyone. Come on, everyone. Let's go camping.
Glamping, it's got to be the ugliest word. Yeah.
Jonathan, surely.
It's not.
They don't do it. They don't do it in North.
I'm sorry. I was going to say we don't go outside London for our slang. Well, unless we jump to New York.
I'm hoping we've got a bit of a slang-tastic kind of.
I've got some slang-tastic info, but it's we'll see.
We'll see. On that note, hello and welcome to Backlisted, the podcast that gives new life to old books. As usual, we're gathered around the kitchen table in the luxurious Islington Canalside office of Unbound, the website which brings authors and readers together to make great books. You might hear ducks quack, you might hear kettles boil, but that's the joy of a rich audio environment. I'm John Mitchinson, the publisher of Unbound.
I'm Andy Miller, author of The Year of Reading Dangerously. We're joined, as we always are, by the writer and expert, Matthew Clayton.
Campologist.
The public have had enough of experts, Matthew. But
Kind words, Andy. Kind words.
And joining us today is Jonathon Green. Jonathan is a writer, historian, survivor, and chronicler of the London 60s hippie underground. And he is the English language's very own slang lexicographer. You can find him on Twitter at Mr_Slang. Is that correct, Jonathan?
That sounds good to me.
All right, good. And for the last 4 decades, Jonathan has been cataloguing, codifying, and communicating the joys of the fruitier side of the English language, leading no less person than former blacklisted subject. The person who coined the term Mr. Slang was
Martin Amos. In a very, very, very small footnote.
Yeah.
Okay.
We must take what we can.
We should say that just to amplify that, Jonathan is absolutely is the sole proprietor, owner, compiler, editor of what I, back when we worked together in my Castle days, called the OED of the street. But Green's Dictionary of Slang is one of the great edifices of modern reference publishing. And if you out there haven't got a copy, you should get one.
And I will add to that if, like me, you are a 60s obsessive, and you read, as I did in 1989, I think I read it.
88, maybe.
I had to wait for the paperback.
I got a free one.
A book called Days in the Life, Voices from the English Underground, which is a magnificent, important classic book.
Absolutely superb.
You did a few oral histories as well, for the oral history of...
I did 6. Immigrants, which I would love to do again now.
Cannabis, was that an oral history? Was that...
No, that was more a sort of...
Personal journey.
Also, we should mention, in distinguished in passing, Chasing the Sun, the history of lexicography.
Yes, that's what I did move on from the 60s.
Also,
as I love the 60s.
Also, Jonathan, I met Jonathan when I interviewed him about his book, Odd Job Man. Oh, yeah. Odd Job Man is a category we're very fond of here on Backlisted. The biblio-memoir. It is a biblio-memoir, yes.
I think it is.
Didn't you cut your teeth, Jonathan, writing erotica for Fiesta magazine?
I don't think Fiesta really jibes with the word erotica. He's what was known as a top shelf title. It was wonderful. I mean, I was the letters editor of Fiesta for 4 glorious weeks. I'd broken up with a woman who just started the first feminist magazine in the country, Rosie Boycott, and I thought, what can I do? I know I'll go and work for Fiesta. And we used to get these wonderful... We're not really here talking about this, but we did used to get the most amazing letters. I mean, they say everything's made up. I'm sure the letters were made up, but the letters as letters, written in green ink on lined paper, both sides of the paper, were, I fear, very true. And I could, if you like, expatiate upon this, but perhaps I shouldn't.
Well, we'll see where we get to. But moving on, you're here to talk to us about Absolute Beginners by Colin McInnes. Great London novel, cult novel.
I'm going to stay in interest here as well. I consider the whole purpose of Backlisted to have been to get to this point. So watch out, everyone.
So perhaps briefly then, Andy,
yes,
briefly, time-honoured fashion, what else have you been reading?
So I have been reading, actually, to tell you the truth, I have mostly been reading books by Colin McInnes this week.
Have you not read them all already?
Yes, but I hadn't. Well, we'll come on to it. I had read them several times when I was a teenager, and I'd read Absolute Beginners, I guess, on average every 3 or 4 years for the last 30 years. But I hadn't read the other 2 novels in his London trilogy since the 80s. So I went back and read those again. But we'll talk about that in a minute. What I want to talk about is that I was in Paris last weekend. We took my niece to Paris. She's going back to Australia. She's been living here for a year. So we went to Paris for the day, and I was allowed special dispensation while my family went on the Bateau Mouche to leg it to the Palais de Tokyo to go and see the Michel Houellebecq exhibition. Restez vivant, to stay alive.
That's got a corky.
I'm going to explain all about, on the front of the catalogue, which I brought with me, there's a picture of his late dog, a corgi called Clément.
I bet you're sad you laughed now, aren't you?
Which I'm gonna.
It's got a wonderful moody face.
Yeah.
But this exhibition, anyone who knows the things I write about will know that I'm a big fan of Houellebecq. He is my favourite living writer, for better or worse, which means I spend my life telling people that Michel Houellebecq is my favourite living writer, and they go, but he's awful. And I say, no, that's interesting because you don't understand him. And we go from there. But I really love his work. I think he is very funny and very pessimistic in a kind of Eeyore-ish way, which I really like. And so anyway, at the Palais de Tokyo, which is, I suppose, the Parisian equivalent of the ICA, isn't it, Jonathan, really?
Something like those.
Yeah. There's an exhibition that he's curated, I suppose you'd say, about his... the things that inform his work or things that he loves. So you pass through a series of rooms that contain, as you would expect from Houellebecq, there's a brilliant computer screen that says, against a black and white background, "Vous n'avez aucune chance." You have no chance. Continuez, and then a button that says, okay. It's like the Baghetti and I can't go on, you'll go on. Okay. And there's a room, because he's fascinated by, for instance, the travel industry, which is one of the things that he wrote about in a novel called Platform. There's a room where the floor is entirely made of postcards. You walk across this horrible selection of postcards that have been laid out to create this awful sense of an infinity of terrible choices available to you as holiday destinations. And then there's another room which you go into where an office has been built in the middle of it. And inside the office is just the most horrible slag heap of books and records and a keyboard and a computer and some Playmobil and a book of erotica. And I was thinking, that looks like my office. So that's brilliant. And then you go into a room of his pornographic photographs. But then you come out into a room devoted to his late dog, Clément. And brilliantly, it's laid out like he lived in Ireland while Clément was alive. He was living in Ireland. It's laid out like an Irish funeral parlour. It has it has laminated wooden walls and a tartan carpet. It has photos of Clement on the wall. It has a piece of music by Iggy Pop playing about how what is a dog? A dog is a machine for love. And in the middle is a vitrine full of, in chronological order, all Clement's toys from the time he was a puppy until he died. And it is given in the true Welbeckian fashion. You've been through this series of terrible, filthy, alienated environments, and suddenly you're in this room of actual love. It's incredibly moving. Incredibly moving. And I thought it was wonderful. It won't come to the UK. But
clearly it won't. Well, why?
Well, first of all, I think it's difficult to move, but also it's clearly been funded by
those crazy French.
But I was thinking, I can think of other British cultural figures who might do it, but I was trying to think of a British author who would do the same thing, who would have an aesthetic that you could represent in different media, and people wouldn't think they were a...
Meads might be somewhere,
Meads, yeah. Jonathan Meads.
I cannot imagine an equivalent in the UK. No. I just cannot imagine it.
No, you can't imagine.
He also, I wouldn't say a run-in, but I was once 5 or 10 years ago, brought in by the radio, and he was supposed to be talking about his attitude to the 60s, which of course is that I don't like it. Because I'd done Days in the Life, I was dragged in, and we were there, and it was 8 a.m. And I went in, and I was looking around, I thought, who's the tramp sitting over? And he was sort of there, down in the green room. Obviously, well, it seemed to me that he was pissed as a fart at 8 in the morning. And what I realised now, and I, in my stupid naivety, and he would not speak English, although I'm sure he can, because he was living in Ireland, and he was giving them a hard time. And I, in my naivety, was trying to help. He must have thought I was mind-numbingly stupid, as indeed I was. You could see that, I can't remember, I mean, it wasn't the start of the week, I can't remember what it was. It was something quite major on BBC, and they could see that the interviewers, sweat running down their faces. Why can't we get something out of him? He's famous. Say something to us. But he said nothing.
He gave an interview a couple of weeks ago to the FT, where he said, what I sort of think is an emblematically brilliant bit of Welbeck, I simply don't care. He said... They said, "Well, I'm the best novelist in the world. That brings certain problems." And the interviewer said, "But what?" I said, "I'm flabbergasted." And I say, "But what about Philip Roth?" And Welbeck looks at me and says, "No, he's repetitive."
But what has he meant with people who the French adore, like David Lodge and Ian McEwan, who they worship? I personally don't like either.
I can't imagine he'd have a huge amount of time for Ian McEwan. Or David Lodge even less.
But you know what? We like McEwan and we like Lodge, but we can't imagine David Lodge curating an exhibition himself at the ICA, can we? So...
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What percentage of the audience who went to see this exhibition is aware of what the Irish funeral parlour looks like?
But presumably very few. But also it's worth saying that the audience there were incredibly mixed in terms of ages and genders, that it wasn't, furtive misogynists such as myself. There were people of all colours, creeds and genders there.
In hijabs?
No, it's not. I spent a certain amount of time in Paris. Corgis are not big in France, I don't think. So It's interesting that he should choose a corgi as his snuff object.
So that's what I
don't
doing.
See many of them.
I was sort of reading the exhibition. That's what I'm saying. But John, what have you been reading?
Well, I've been reading The Beast, the second in a trilogy of novels by Paul Kingsnorth. Should disclaimer alert and all that we published The Wake, which was longlisted for the Booker and won the Gordon Byrne Prize and shortlisted for various others. And it is an extraordinary book, which everybody remembers because it was written in a kind of a invented language that was not modern English and not Anglo-Saxon, but a kind of an amalgam of the two, and was remarkable. This is completely different. This is set now. and it's a very, very it's a shorter, much more in a way there is a sensibility that it shares with The Wake. It's a very uncompromising book, more like a prose poem really than a work of fiction. There's only one character, and you meet this character in a farmhouse, or a half derelict farmhouse on what one imagines is Dartmoor, being pelted by rain. It's very unclear exactly what happens, except that there is a terrible accident and he's injured, and he kind of manages to heal himself sufficiently to walk into the edge of the local town. He sees a beast, an animal, sort of beast of large, what turns out to be a large cat, you think, and becomes obsessed with hunting it and finding it. And that is essentially the plot of the novel. Is he goes into town and he comes back again. And I'm not going to tell you whether he finds the beast or not, because insofar as there is a plot in this book, it's that. But it is, I have to say, and the character is called Edward Buckmaster, and those who read The Wake will know that Buckmaster was the main character in The Wake. It's very, very intense, and it's totally in that sort of almost Kafka way of, he just takes this scenario and totally milks it for as much as it can get. And the landscape, insofar again as there are characters, the landscape is a character. The sense of,
is it set in the same place?
No, it's definitely different. You learn more about him through the book. You learn that he's obviously left his wife and child to come and do this. It's not clear what he's doing or why he's doing it, but there is a sort of a sense that he's in some sense a kind of, he's like a hermit. He's gone into the wilderness to fast. I mean, he doesn't eat. He drinks a lot of water. He as I say, he could manage to heal himself. I'll give you go. I'll read one little small passage from it.
How does how does it relate to The Wake besides
only in a kind of, you'd have to really know to call it a sequel to The Wake would be misleading for a lot of people who might be expecting.
But he's referring to it as a trilogy, isn't he?
And he's doing, the idea is 1,000 years ago, now 1,000 years hence. That's the plan for the trilogy. Right. And the only real crossover is the name. But there is a kind of a sense of a man dislocated, not feeling part of the modern world, not feeling able to in a way, impotent, not able to, but gains in power. And the presentation of the beast in the book, and the beast is kind of the landscape and is the weather and is and it's as good as anything I've ever read on that. That thing of that the landscape is a outward manifestation of our inner kind of state. He writes. I mean, it's brilliant. It's kind of compelling. I mean, you can't. I'd be, if you don't like very long kind of sentences without much punctuation, it might not be for you. But if you kind of like that sort of slightly messianic strain in literature, it's good. But I'll just read you this bit because I think it
even negging us there, Joe.
Yes, sorry. It would be impossible for me to guess even how much time passed in this way. This is when he's injured. Every day was the same, and this was simply how it had always been. Every day in the stone room, with the table and chair, with the cupboard and the window, with the white heat outside and around me. I was here and perhaps had always been here, or perhaps had never been here before, but I didn't think much about it. I had my body to think about. I had to rebuild it. I was being born again in the world, retraining my muscles, understanding my pain. So intense and I think pretty remarkable.
It's very good reviews already, isn't it? I read a review by M. John Harrison in the Guardian.
Yeah, which is a very
terrific review.
I mean, he's writing in that kind of tradition of sort of, it's that sort of almost Blakean kind of visionary prose, I suppose. And I saw
a comparison. It wasn't in Mike's review; it was somewhere else. To Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah,
is that?
Yeah, I think there are elements. There are definitely elements of the kind of the road. Kind of end of Cormac McCarthy's oeuvre, maybe. It's not really much. He's not. I mean, he's certainly ploughing his own interesting furrow in English. In English fiction.
Do you know whether he's written all three of them?
No, he hasn't written the third one yet. I do know that.
Right.
But I have to say, it's always The Wake has been so intimately bound up with Unbound. I was kind of slightly trepidatious reading. This is published by Faber and very well published as well, and it's beautifully done. But I have to say it more than exceeded my expectations. So definitely one for that kind of person who likes that kind of book. But now, come on,
let's go.
I didn't read this book 54 years ago. I finished reading it 20 minutes ago for the first time, which is a huge embarrassment because, you know, it is one of those books which I know that everybody really should have read, particularly people who have spent as much time in Soho and love London and jazz and fashion and music as much as I do. But anyway, hadn't read it, and now I've read it, and guess what?
Two thumbs up.
It's really good. It's brilliant. It is. But I love that thing when you haven't read something and you read it for the first time, and the language is just more. It's just better than you imagine it.
You know, Jonathan, the last episode of Backlisted we recorded was with Selena Godden and was about Last Exits of Brooklyn by Hubert Selby, and we were saying last time this episode is almost like part 2. In a way, because of they're nothing like one another books, but they have cult status, and yet their cult status kind of diminishes them as books. Because what John is saying is what we were saying about Hubert Selby last time, that actually reading Last Exit to Brooklyn, which I never had done, I was thinking, wow, this is great. This isn't good for a cult book. This is the real thing. So, Jonathan, when did you first encounter Absolute Beginners by Colin McInnes?
I reckon I was 16 because it says 1964, so it's not 54 years. Actually, it's only 52. But I would give anything. I really mean it. And Andy and I have discussed this. Reading it at 16, and I've read it over the years for one reason or another, to gut it for its slang, whatever it might be for my dictionaries. But reading it again at sour old 68, I'd love to recreate the excitement that book brought me, the knowledge it brought me. Now, because I'm sour old 68, I can compare it with other work he did and say, well, he's being a bit didactic here. He's recycling a few pieces he wrote for Encounter, da-da-da-da. But at the time, it was just eye-opening. It was fantastic. And to cut from the book to my first visit, which would have been a year or so later, to Notting Hill, and walking down into Notting Hill, Portobello particularly, Ladbroke Grove, and thinking, he calls that area Napoli, and walking through there and suddenly going, fuck me, I'm in Napoli. It's heaven. Yeah. And absolutely loving it. And it's just one of those, I mean, when you're that age, you're like a sponge. Well, I think I don't know, now I'm sort of dried up, old God knows what. But at that age, one's like a sponge, and they were this amazing input. Ironically, because he never touches them, there were the things like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, so on. For me, Brecht, whatever.
Yeah.
But at the time, 64, these things were all flooding into my life. And one of the things that was flooding into my life was Colin McInnes, and in particular, Absolute Beginners. Again, it was that age when you educated yourself through Penguin books. And although Tony Godwin, who was the great editor of the time, had changed things and put, God help us, pictures on the cover, nonetheless, I think for me, I was still of a generation which had been started off in the 30s, aggrandized in the 40s in the war, because you could put your Penguin book into your battle dress pocket and so on and so forth. We were still educating ourselves very much through Penguins. I was a snotty little bastard. I wouldn't read Pan.
Funnily enough, that's something. I just bought a copy of this book called No Novel Reader by McInnes, which was published in 74 or 5, near the end of his life. And he talks exactly about that. He talks about the effect of Penguin paperbacks on generations of people who had not been able to reach books. You know, as you say, their kind of autodidactic element to it. It was suddenly, you could do that if you wanted to in a way that perhaps hadn't been possible before.
The interesting thing with Penguins also were not like their American equivalents from, albeit I think Alan Lane took the idea from America. But I mean, in the specific area of writing about the young, writing about teenagers, I mean, most of the stuff that you'd get in the States in those days was written maybe by Harlan Ellison or by Hal Elson, who was a different person, or by Wendell Brown or by a load of people. But they would always be called things like Jailbait and Switchblade.
They were pulp, right?
They were pulp. They're great. I love them. But nonetheless, McInnes was completely different.
I will echo what you're saying, Jonathan, in as much as, again, I've written about this at length, but I read Absolute Beginners as many people my age would have done in the 80s. I read it in 1984 when I was on holiday in the Western Isles of Scotland with my parents when I was 16.
Oh, I love that.
I'm sure that was 1974.
I don't know. Well, I know, absolutely. But I remember reading the bit that I just watched Mitch read just now, those last 30 pages. I remember reading those on the deck of a Caledonian McBrain ferry on the way back from Iona to Oban. And the thing is, there's a phrase that I really dislike in the publishing world and in the world, which is this book changed my life. And what that normally means is I really like this book. But in the case of Absolute Beginners, this is probably the one or two or three maybe books that changed my life. And I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about books now had I not read this book. And also in terms of what I felt about politics and what I felt about other races and difference and the potential of being young, all those things which sound a bit like cliches, and yet they were totally true. And so when I come back to this book now, I always come back to it. It probably is my favourite book for sentimental reasons, but I always come back to it with a slight fear that the magic will have gone. And I have to say, reading it last week, I first 30 pages, I was thinking, oh no, I don't know, but then it got me. Like it always gets me. I think it's unique. It's a unique book. It's flawed, but what it has, the spirit of it, is probably not found anywhere else.
I don't think it changed my life, but I think it broadened it enormously. And maybe that's the same as change. I'm not sure. Going back to the sponge thing, you're just so open, or you should be, and I know I was, to as it were, suggestion. And for me, perhaps the biggest suggestion was books, although rock and roll and so on and so forth were also enormously suggestive, as it were. McInnes just taught you a lot of stuff that, I mean, I'd been alive. I'd known that, I was obviously a little bit younger, or maybe a lot younger, when Oswald Mosley was basically winding people up for race riots. And you could still go, when I went to Napoli, as it were, it still said KBW on the walls, keep Britain white. Yeah. All that shit was still there. It was a very different place, Notting Hill. As everybody knows, I always expect when I go there now, which is not very often, that I will be walking down streets paved with gold, but it's still the same old gate, basically. But I don't know. I mean, it's just hard to say. Wait, it had an enormous effect. It was just educational, I suppose. And there is that element that runs through the whole of McInnes's work, which is very didactic. Yeah, and the trouble, I think, is that the wonderful thing is that it's invisible. It's invisible. Like with Dickens, you don't notice, and I'm talking as a slang lexicographer, you don't notice that he's actually read a book about a dictionary of criminal slang, but he puts it into Oliver Twist and you don't see the seams. Again, obviously, McInnes, particularly with the race riot stuff, had done his research, had taken it on board, so on and so forth, but you don't see the seams. By the time you get to the later books in the trilogy, you do see them too much, and that's why they're not.
If anybody's seen, there's a couple of films that, if you want to know sort of what Notting Hill was like, or Napoli was like. No, I was going to mention there's two films I was going to mention. One of them is 10 Rillington Place. Yeah. If you look at 10 Rillington Place and you see what that area looked like then, but also there's a film. Do you remember a film, Jonathan, called Leo the Last?
I do. The John Borman when film. I was around. But even more, if you want to, I've always wanted to run a night of London geographical films, and one of them, of course, it would be The Blue Lamp, because the last 5 or 10 minutes of The Blue Lamp, when they have the huge chase, or maybe it's not the last 5. Anyway, there is a 10-minute chunk of The Blue Lamp, which goes, as far as I recall, from Westbourne Park to Ladbroke Grove and so on. In fact, I think all the way through to Shepherd's Bush. And virtually none of that is there. Certainly Westbourne Park, when you realise that the church that's in the middle of Westbourne Park, it was not isolated, but was surrounded by terraces. And those things are wonderful.
I mean,
and McInnes does that. I mean, I think one of the things about McInnes that's incredibly important, because people talk about the teenagers and pop and so on and so forth, which we should get round to. But he is a London novelist. He's a major London novelist.
I think that's what I...
And perhaps that's why he lasts, because he just, the bits I love, as I say, the idea, I am in Napoli, he's portrayed it to me, he's shown it to me, and here it is in 3 dimensions, was so exciting.
I think that's the thing, that the two things that struck me. One was I'm very, very pleased I hadn't seen the film, the Julian Temple film, so I didn't want to be carrying around the style in my head. You know, you have an idea that it is a kind of it's a sort of Tommy Steele movie, but I
would rather die than see the film.
Yeah, well, that was one thing. The second thing was I was much more interested. What really interested me was the Londonness, for sure. It does make you want to go to Notting Hill and wander. It does make you want to go to Soho. Yeah. But the language, the dialogue in particular, I think is really it's arresting and not in a kind of hey daddy-o kind of way. I mean, there's a really, it's just really, I found myself reading and rereading passages from it and marking them and just thinking, you know, it's a proper literary novel.
Shall I just give the synopsis before you read a bit? So I'm going to read I'm going to read the blurb on the back of the Penguin edition from 1965. With the Peter Blake cover. It says, our guide on this conducted tour of London's teenage subgroups is an astonishingly, sparklingly articulate 18-year-old photographer. He's actually 19, everyone. Street, holiday, park, studio, artistic poses, and when I can find a client, pornographic, with a riotous line in espresso patter. From Belgravia to Shepherd's Bush, we drift with him among a colourful set of contacts and cronies. Crêpe Suzette, his spade-crazy 17-year-old chick, Edward the Ted, the homosexual hoplite, Zesty Boy Sift, the pop songwriter, in a hilarious round of the jazz dives, drinking clubs and parties of all kinds where this under-20 underworld hangs out. Climax of this modern Mayhew comes when our likeable guide gets involved in the Notting Hill's race riots with an unexpected result. That's not a very good blurb, is it? That doesn't do justice to this book at all.
What fascinates me, though, is that, of course, that I would have read age 16, because I'm sure you've gone through that, I'm sure everybody has. Why did I pick this book up? Why did I go up to the counter of wherever it was and offer 3 and 6pence, which would have been a lot to me in those days, still is, and read this? I mean, it's so bad. And they cannot even get Ed the Ted right. He has to be Edward the Ted. And you wonder if it was some nice young boy who'd just come down from Oxford, and it was, you do this. I don't know.
The word John...
And Paul Sock's review is embarrassing as well, but she talks about it's a real gasser.
Oh,
I mean, the thing about the language, if I may, tout my slang hat for a while, is that it's very good. He makes up I'm talking about the slang. And the slang he uses, he uses about 200 words in it, it's right. That's the point. It's right. He makes up a few things, I think. I mean, I've never found right at the beginning, he uses the word Felix to mean penis, and he talks about it in the context of skyscrapers and tower blocks, I think he's talking about. And he talks about Felixes rising to the clouds, cloud kisses and so on, and I think that was him having fun, maybe, but most of what he uses is very much from...
I read that differently. See, I think that's on the first page, right?
Yeah, it is.
And the line says...
prove me wrong.
No, I just... I'm just like... these... Yeah. Like Cinerama, you can see clean new concrete cloud kisses rising up like Felixes from the old Englishy squares. See, I thought what I read that as, and what I've always read that as, is he's getting the word phoenix wrong. Yeah. I thought that he thinks he knows it all, which is a big part of the character of the narrator.
When your life is dedicated to collecting 1,400 synonyms for the word penis and many other things, I'm afraid it becomes very narrow once. But I think that's how I saw it in 1964. And it's interesting. Maybe it's a combo. I don't know. And when I think when he uses about zips, when I think he's talking about drugs or is it drink, I can't remember. He talks about zips and he's talking about by which he means sips, small quantities. As far as I know, that doesn't exist anywhere else. There's a few like that. This isn't to put it. And there's one or two things I can't. There's one word that he puts in there, and this is me being so pedantic. He uses the word wrought to mean upset, which is hugely common in Australia and completely non-existent as far as I'm aware in the UK at the time.
And we should say that he was brought up in Australia.
Yes, that seems very. He's a voyeur, is he not? And that's an enormous. Not only is he didactic, he's also, I think, teaching himself, and he's telling us what he's learning. And the excerpt from Horace Ove that I quite like.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Is saying that.
Just on the Felix thing, it just made me think, because I just read the last. Right. There's a great little paper. He gets a lift at the end by Mickey Ponderosa. And Mickey didn't seem to approve of this, although I thought the cat might be flattered. He said, I thought the cat might be flattered, meaning him. He said once, a Roman always a Roman. And in every country, there were horrors as well as felicities. That was the word he used. I just thought that sort of Felix of felicity is not a word you get.
John.
New Vitamin Water Zero Sugar Pineapple Passion Fruit is packed with vitamins. Just like the amount of peas we packed in that sentence. It's packed like your tote bag. The one you stole from your ex. Or your overpriced half a studio apartment. Or extra rushed rush hour traffic. Packed like your calendar. Triple booked at 5, of course. Grab a vitamin water. Did we mention it's packed with vitamins?
John and Jonathan were both talking about London. This is a book about London.
Yeah.
I just want to read one paragraph which I think illustrates how McInnes writes about London, but it also illustrates something else that I just want to bring attention to because I love it so much in this book. This is like in the first section. So I went out of the Dubious, which is a drinking club.
I'm just about to. I had exactly the same passage.
There you go.
It's such a.
So I went out of the Dubious to catch the summer evening breeze. The night was glorious out there. The air was sweet as a cool bath. The stars were peeping nosily beyond the neons, and the citizens of the Queendom, in their jeans and separates, were floating down the Shaftesbury Avenue canals like gondolas. Everyone had loot to spend. Everyone a bath with verbena salts behind them, and nobody had broken hearts because they were all ripe for the easy summer evening. The rubber plants in the espressos had been dusted, and the smooth white lights of the new-style Chinese restaurant, not the old Mahjong categories, but the latest thing, with broad glass fronts and Dacron curtainings, and a beige carpet over the interiors, were shining a dazzle like some monster telescreens. Even those horrible old Anglo-Saxon public houses, all potato crisps and flat stale ale and puddles on the counter bar and spittle, look quite alluring, provided you didn't push those 2-ton doors that pinch your arse and wander in. In fact, the capital was a night horse dream. And I thought, my lord, one thing is certain, and that's that they'll make musicals one day about the glamour-studded 1950s. And I thought, my heaven, one thing is certain too, I'm miserable. Oh. I mean, first of all, so that's beautiful, right? But the second thing to say about it, and the thing that Jonathan and I were talking about this week, for me, the reason why this book still, why it spoke to me then and it still works now, is it captures that adolescent mixture of front and vulnerability better than any other book I can think of, bar none. That there's that sense of the guy who's got all the answers, but at some level saying, please, someone hug me, is so powerful. The analogy that I mean, it's coincidentally, it's a mod thing, but the analogy, the thing it most reminds me of is Quadrophenia. Yeah. Because it's a similar kind of Jimmy in Quadrophenia in whichever version you care to take. But Jimmy in Quadrophenia is that fantastic mixture of Street Fighter and kid having a nervous breakdown. Incredibly vulnerable, but with all the chat. And that, to me, seems to be the thing that in Absolute Beginners... You know, Jonathan, we were saying McInnes is probably not a great novelist, though this is a great novel. And I almost feel with Absolute Beginners that there's some happy, almost accidental coming together of his talents, vernacular, timing, that lead him to produce this amazing book, which is not quite,
Well, conscious.
Yeah.
I don't think that, because he's born in 1914. So we're talking about somebody who's no longer a baby, almost as old as me. But he's and there's certain elements in which, as we say, he's a voyeur. He wants to teach us stuff, but somehow it all comes together in Absolute Beginners. And as you say, it worked for you in the 80s. It works for John now, and it certainly worked for me back then. But I don't think he knew quite what he was doing, because you can be very cynical and say, well, he did the bits, as I said before, he did the bits on pop stars and so on and so forth, and on the way, and teenagers, and on there's one called Sharp Schmutter about clothes, all for Encounter in the late 50s, very early 60s, and you can see they're being brought together in certain ways, but again, not obviously, to create certain areas of Absolute Beginners, to create the atmosphere, not the dialogue, but the atmosphere. But he transcends it. He manages to transcend it. And the fact that the three of us, reading it at different times initially, still find it a fascinating book is a huge tick, as it were. I should have a better word, but it's an enormous encomium, to go to the other end of the vocabulary, that he managed to do this. And he doesn't do it in the others. Unfortunately, he doesn't. And when you move outside the trilogy, I tried to read other stuff, and I didn't enjoy it.
Also, the thing about McInnes as a novelist, to his credit, is that even within these three London novels, City of Spades, Absolute Beginners, Mr. Love and Justice, he's not trying to write the same book every time. He's trying to write a different kind of novel every time, unfortunately, with mixed results, because either he doesn't have this kind of lucky thing to access, or else the setting doesn't quite match the subject.
He's trying too hard, dare I say. The other book I think is worth mentioning is Crust on Its Uppers.
By Derek Raymond.
By Derek Raymond, in fact, by Robin Cook. And the Crust on Its Upper, I mean, there are very few, I'd almost say no books about the 60s, and I raise my fingers at that point in quotes, because one of the things, we didn't do that. I mean, what people wrote was manifestos or newspapers or rock and roll lyrics or films that never got made or whatever it might be. But actual novels, you waited for a while the grown-ups were doing it. Evelyn Waugh was still knocking stuff out. Kingsley Amis was still knocking out whoever it might be. The likes of me look to America anyway. But the two books that actually, they're both really late 50s books, but they segue into the 60s. And the one is Absolute Beginners, and the other is the Chelsea set book, which is Crust on Its Uppers. And there's a character in Absolute Beginners called the ex-Deb of last year, and you can see that's the world she comes from. And it's a very different world, but there's no way that I, as a 16-year-old, could have related to that at all. Jonathan Meades turned me on to it, but much, much later. And it's a fascinating book. It's a wonderful book, but it hasn't got the feel for the world in the same way at all.
I just wanted to say something though about the narrator in the book, that English Holden Caulfield type of narrator, but it's incredibly honest. It's very difficult with cult books because it's so connected in most people's minds, this book, with the coffee bar culture, with, I guess, the proto-mod. He's brilliant on clothes, on dress sizes, on fashion, very, very detailed accounts of the clothes that the people are wearing. But there's one passage I like. This Deb of last year says, about being honest about the teenage experience. I really like this, but he said, she held my arm and said, "Tell me a secret about you teenagers. Do you have a very active sex existence?" Which is a pretty good question. And then, "They can't keep off it." "No," I replied, "we don't." And as a matter of fact, what I said was true, because although you often see teenagers boxed up together in a free and easy, intimate sort of way, it doesn't very often reach the point of no return. But in the kingdom we reside in, the firm belief of the venerable seems to be that if you see kids out and about enjoying themselves, then fleshy vices must be at the bottom of it all somewhere, not just as it often is, frisking and frolicking and having a carefree ball, which I felt was an authentic insight. And that's what I remember, what teenagers are always assumed to be, shagging each other's senses. Actually, the truth is that they're dressing up, having fun, and not
hoping for the best.
Hoping for the best.
Before we say anything more, I just want to do the little potted biography of McInnes, because then we can talk a bit about how he came to write this particular book. So he was born in 1914, died age 61 on the 22nd of April 1976. He was the son of the singer James Campbell McInnes and the novelist Angela Thirkell. He was the great-grandson of the pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones. He was
Yeah, that's quite.
He was the cousin.
That's a tenuous link that you missed there.
He was the cousin of Rudyard Kipling and Stanley Baldwin.
Yeah.
When he was a boy, the family decamped from. They lived in Kensington, then they moved to Australia. He grew up in Melbourne, only returned to England in his teens. So he's like a really interesting mixture of. This is what Tony Gould says in the biography. He's like a mixture of Edwardian intelligentsia, Australia in the 1920s, and London's post-war Bohemia, and he habitually described himself, McInnes habitually described himself as, quote, an English, London-born, Australian-reared Scot. And fundamentally, he was a journalist and a radio pundit. He used to appear on Today, or the equivalent thereof. He used to appear on a programme called The Critics regularly. He wrote 1,500 radio scripts for the BBC. He hacked them out.
So how old was he when Absolute McInnes came out?
Mid-40s. And he's the author of 7 novels, the first of which is To the Victor the Spoils, which was published in 1950, the last of which is Out of the Garden in 1974. And he also wrote a very successful book of essays called England Half English, which was published in 1961. I found a wonderful phrase to describe McInnes. This biography is called Inside Outsider. And McInnes never really fitted anywhere. And he's described in the biography by several people as, quote, the rudest man I have ever met.
Did he like a drink?
He very much enjoyed a drink. But also as a wonderful description of someone who knew him for a long time and was friendly with him, who said that McInnes was someone who had been borrowed from death. That he was the saddest and loneliest man that I ever met.
Yeah.
He was always had his face pressed up to the window. Was always looking to belong while simultaneously telling everybody to piss off.
I mean, it is quite a sad novel.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give the ending away, but the ending is very bittersweet. Jonathan, you were going to say.
I was just thinking there, the counterculture. When you start going back to it, and it's a little bit later than all of this, obviously, a decade later, maybe, a little less, but 7 or 8 years, but it was actually powered by not exactly people like McInnes, but it was powered by Australians and by Americans. It was powered by outsiders. And in a way, he fits in that because they want to know. They want to know in a way much more than those of us who already think we know. And that was very much true. And it was one of the things I noticed when I was doing Days in the Life, the oral history of all this stuff, is how many people, the real movers and shakers, and the obvious one being someone like Richard Neville or Germaine Greer, people of that nature, they'd not started off in the UK, and they were telling us about what we were doing. So Richard was certainly that. He was a very good editor at Oz magazine, which he ran, which I think McInnes might have written a couple of pieces.
He did,
for.
yeah, he did.
And McInnes was of that type. There's also obviously a strong streak of George Orwell there, particularly in essays like the Express, the Daily Express families.
Yes, which he says, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He fronts up. He doesn't pretend it's not the case. Not, dare I say, I mean, and because it's sub-Orwell, it's really in the end rather thin. But that's by the by. It's when he's telling us stuff that we haven't noticed. It's when he's explaining stuff. Well, I say we. This is when, for 16-year-old people. One of the things I'm wondering, though, I've been trying to look up what the reviews were like back then. And I must admit, having looked through newspaper databases, I can't find
Well, I must say,
many.
Somebody on Twitter told me to go and look at You Never Had It So Good, or Never Had It So Good by Dominic Sandbrook. Because first of all, it contains some of the reviews of the book, and they are mixed, but mixed in the true sense, rather than mixed meaning bad. They are genuinely
some good,
some bad. But also, Dominic Sandbrook really gives Absolute Beginners a pasting, and he says he describes it as a like a pale copy of Catcher in the Rye. And you know what? Dominic Sandbrook, I hope you hear this.
Doesn't like me either.
Because you didn't get it. You didn't get it.
No. But I don't
didn't get it, but you still had to write something.
I mean, I did mention Holden Caulfield earlier, but it's not like Catcher in the Rye at all.
I don't think
you know what? Catcher in the Rye. The thing about Catcher in the Rye is Catcher in the Rye is a great book. I'm not going to start going, it's no good. It's a great book.
Yeah, it is.
But the things that make it a great book are, for the most part, orthodox and literary. The things that make Absolute Beginners a great book is that it plugs into all these other traditions which Salinger could never get within a million miles of, because it's not his world. Jonathan, you brought something with you which I'm keen to get in.
What was that?
Well, you had a little thing about McInnes, which you had interviewed Horace Ove.
Yeah, Horace Ove was in, I suppose, Michael de Freitas, later Michael X's entourage, and part of the English Black Power movement. And he, as this piece explains, was the person who took the photos for the cover of Absolute Beginners. And indeed, on your I'd never seen that picture before. It's wonderful. Much better, dare I say, than the cover of Absolute Beginners, which is a strange
It's an omnibus edition, which was published in '69, called Visions of London.
The great McGibbon and Key.
I mean, this was an interview I did with Horace, who was by then, I think, teaching at Goldsmiths in 1987. And it goes like this. Colin McInnes was an angry white man, angry with his world, his own class, angry about the way the white working class were treated in this country, angry about the way blacks were treated in this country. And he wanted to do something, and he wanted to expose himself to it. Actually, he was one of the only writers I can't think of any others, even today, that wanted to write about black people, live among black people, get beaten up by black people, sleep with black people, eat with them, and wrote about them. And he understood them because he exposed them himself in the most dangerous situations to find out. And as a parenthesis, Horace is obviously talking more about City of Spades than he in the context of than Absolute Beginners. And he did understand black people, but his only fault that he was pushing too hard. He was angrier than the black people he talked to. So although black people got involved with Colin and understood him and he helped a lot, they were a bit scared of him in a way, because he would get very upset if he didn't understand what was going on and what you should do with it. He was the only person who wrote an interesting article about Michael X after everybody else had condemned him. I found him very interesting because I got very friendly with Colin. I first met him in a room with several other people, and I didn't know who the hell he was. And he was talking about cannibalism in the Caribbean and how the Caribs ate people. And I didn't know who he was. And I said, "You're talking bullshit, man. There's no cannibalism in the Caribbean." And he said, "Don't you tell me that. What do you know about it?" "I'm telling you there is." And I said, "No." And we had a heated argument. What he didn't realize was that before coming to the UK, I'd been working with a paleontologist, working with a very old German anthropologist who'd spent 30-something years trying to find out whether there was any cannibalism in the Caribbean. And he discovered that there wasn't any fucking cannibalism. And it was some kind of folklore. They could have been just eating monkeys. But Colin had this naive attitude. He couldn't believe this, and he wouldn't believe it. And after the argument, he said, "Well, I like that. I like it when someone attacks me." And that's what he loved. He wanted someone to fight back. And I got to know him, and he took me into McGibbon and Key and demanded that I did some of his book covers. So I did Absolute Beginners and the others.
I mean, that's
great.
I feel I should also add that in terms of, certainly in City of Spades, some of the language that's used probably hasn't worn very well, very of its time. But also, you know, that criticism that we were talking about, you know, his attitudes are colonial is probably one way of putting it. And yet he's trying to do something in an era where there was no
This is what it comes down to. This is what we discussed. This is, in the end, you can say this wasn't quite right and that wasn't quite right and it's too didactic and it's too voyeuristic and so on. But he did it. And the one thing I did experience, which with respect to you all, and no one else would have been there, was that it was the first time anybody had done it for us in the UK, in London at the time. And that was remarkable.
Yeah.
For that, I am in his debt forever.
And I'm in his debt forever for writing a book that apparently in my state of arrested adolescence, I can never quite get away from.
I'm going to give it to my 18-year-old when I get home, because I think he'd absolutely love it. And I sort of think it is a good book for teenagers to read. I wish I'd read it when I was a teenager.
The number of people, fascinatingly, I've been talking about my book, or people will often ask me, what's your favourite book, or what's a book that would get people reading? I often mention Absolute Beginners, and fascinatingly, John, you said it when we started, well, everybody knows this book. So, you know what? This book is being forgotten.
Yeah.
That's it. It is in the process of passing into history. That how few people have heard of it. It's partly because of the film, because the film killed the book. But also, I guess, and the number of people who've read it, not everyone has read it and loved it. I won't, make a false claim there. But many have. And many people have said to me, this should be on the curriculum. This is a book that's dealing with things, albeit in ways that are worth discussing from a historical perspective, but things that are happening in the UK now.
On the wrong side of the political correctness divide. I wonder if that's
Perhaps.
likely that it just is a little bit too kind of lively to...
I don't know. I don't do PC. Slang doesn't do PC.
Praise the Lord.
I can't... I don't know. I mean... As I say, it wasn't a problem I had to come up against at the time. Whether it would now be consigned to the grim ranks of young adults, I hate to think. I hope not.
It's too good for
I
that.
hope not.
Hey, Matthew.
Yeah.
Andy.
Do you have any yet more tenuous links?
Yes, I've got one to
Or
finish this up.
tenebrous links.
Tenebrous links. So I've got a link, in fact, to a previous podcast of ours.
Wow.
Which is a bit meta.
That is self-referential. Yeah.
So in a previous podcast we did, Andrew Mel came in and talked about Raymond Chandler's
High Window, yes,
High
that's
Window.
right, High Window.
High Window, and I was delighted that there was a line in High Window about Pink-Headed Bug that the Leeds art punk band, the Three Johns, had turned into a single. And I was delighted to read Absolute Beginners because on about page 10, Colin talks about teenagers going to record shops, and he uses the phrase teenage nightingales to wax, which remarkably the Three Johns also stole and turned into a song.
Wow.
I was just going to ask, having now got my taste for McInnes, should I read the trilogy? Should I read City of Spades next?
City of Spades, yes. When you read Mr. Love and Justice, you should read it because you're completist, I'm sure. And it's necessary. But you'll get, I fear, more and more cross.
Right.
They're fascinating.
Yeah.
You know so much. I mean, there's stuff in, for instance, Mr. Love and Justice, which at the time was fascinating because forget the pimp-whore relationship. Just talking about places in the East End which were only black sailors were going there and so on and so forth. That doesn't exist anymore. We're back to the London thing. And on the London level, those books are very good. They are not absolute beginners. For me, they're too didactic.
Yeah.
But I must say your own mind.
I agree with Jonathan. I mean, I think City of Spades is well worth reading, and England Half English is actually worth reading.
Oh,
in
yes,
terms of his essays. Not all, but some of them are absolutely terrific.
Correct.
I was, you were talking about the Three Johns, Matthew. This book has given me so much, right? And I read it because I like the Jam. And the Jam had
song.
a single called Absolute Beginners, right? That's why I read it. It's 1981. And there's a lyric in Absolute Beginners, again, when I was 13, didn't mean so much to me. It's got the lyric, it's like Weller is trying to find the essence of the book.
This is from Welbeck to Weller, isn't it?
Welbeck to Weller, that's my next book. And so the other way around, Weller to Welbeck. And he's trying to find the essence of the book. There's just these two brilliant lines. I need the strength to go and get what I want. I lost a lifetime thinking of it.
Yeah.
It's that brilliant mixture of front and regret. Yeah. I think that's the thing that's so powerful in this book for me.
Can I ask you one last question, Jonathan? Was it one of the books that, I mean, your later career as a slang lexicographer, did you, when you were reading it as a 16-year-old, was it the language that kind of that stayed with you?
I don't. Not in this particular book. No. I would love to think that I was this sort of micro slang lexicographer, but actually I wasn't that bad.
Well, I think on that brilliant note, shall we end it? Thanks to Jonathan, to Matthew Clayton, as ever, to producer Matt Hall, and thanks once again to our sponsors Unbound. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BacklistedPod, on Facebook, facebook.com/backlistedpod. And if you
use the extraordinary antiquated system known as iTunes to listen to Backlisted, we'd be grateful if you could rate us or leave a review, or it all helps us spread the word. Ever so humble, yeah.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another show in a fortnight. Until then, good night.
Thanks, everyone.